Quicksilver by Stephanie Spinner. This read-along is for classroom use only. The world is full of Zeus's children, and I am one. If my infant antics had not attracted my father's attention, I might have lived out my days as a shepherd or a farm boy, thinking only of forage and livestock and weather. But on my first day of life, I tricked my brother Apollo so thoroughly that he lost his composure in public. This unprecedented event made Zeus laugh for the first time in decades. "You have a real talent for mischief," he told me, as I stood before him in my swaddling clothes. "I can use someone like you." So he made me his messenger. Part 1. Hell. 1. It's dark and gloomy, and it smells like dead sheep, but when Zeus says, "Go to hell," I go. The Lord of all creation is not a patient deity. Have you ever seen his hands clench and unclench when he's kept waiting? I call it the thunderbolt reflex. Best not trigger it is my advice, unless you long to burst into flames and explode. I do not. So today when Zeus summoned me, I flew right over to his audience hall in my trusty winged sandals. I chose a very high speed, gazelle fleeing lion, and was there in a breath, ready with a good joke, the one about the mortal crossing the road, and a cheerful smile. Then I saw the scowl on Zeus's face and restrained myself. Joking with my father when he's testy is like challenging the Gorgons to a staring contest. Bad idea. And the master of the universe was definitely fuming. Not only that, his sister Demeter was at his feet, sobbing. Her hair was undone, her robes were torn and gaping, and her upturned face was slick with tears. She had clawed at her exposed shoulders, raising crisscrosses of bleeding welts like a mourner in the first throes of grief. The sight sent a thrill of alarm through me. A thrill of curiosity, too. What had caused the harvest goddess such frenzied sorrow? She was normally the most placid of beings. "Hermes!" growled Zeus. "Do you know what that brother of mine has done?" I shook my head. Zeus could only be referring to Hades, lord of the Underworld. His other brother Poseidon, who was perfectly happy riding waves, watching whales, and chasing mermaids, took very little interest in mortal affairs, which was probably why his relations with Zeus were both distant and amicable. So it must be Uncle Hades. When I think of Hades, I feel as if I'm falling and shrinking at the same time. This sounds unpleasant. It is, believe me. The god has no levity, no humor, and no charm. He's been a walking bad mood ever since the day Zeus and Poseidon got all the best parts of creation, leaving him with the underworld, which is, as I mentioned, an armpit. And, no surprise, Hades likes to share his misery. Like a bullying host who presses stale bread and sour wine on his guests, daring them to refuse, Hades makes it impossible for anyone in his purview to breathe freely or step lightly. How? By devising something called the Underworld Codes and Regulations. A set of rules so impossible to remember, much less follow, that it makes Babylonian etiquette look easy. Because of the regulations, the instant you enter Hades' domain, you're doing something wrong. By looking left instead of right, unlawful beholding and viewing, section 32, subsection 11, saying the wrong thing, maladroit utterance, sections 1 through 87, or touching something forbidden, heinous tactile errors, part 560. Your punishment? You're there forever. And if you've come from Brother Zeus's territory, so much the better. Hades hates Zeus, and the feeling is mutual. "He's taken Cory," Zeus rumbled. Hearing her daughter's name, Demeter wailed and struck the floor with her forehead. She and Cory are very close. Zeus raised his voice over Demeter's keening. "Forced her to marry him," he called out. Not much surprises me, but this did. Cory, Demeter's only child, was a young wildflower of a girl, barefoot, meadow dancing, and underdressed. She behaved more like a nymph than a goddess, and I couldn't for the life of me picture her in hell. Neither, clearly, could Demeter. "Bring her back, Zeus," she screamed. "I can't live without her." She resumed her sobbing, and her tears pooled at Zeus's feet. He stepped away from her quickly, looking apprehensive. An unhappy goddess is never fun to be around, but Demeter's mood was downright ominous. In her way, she was as powerful as Zeus. Like him, she could do lots of damage. I threw him a sympathetic look. "She stopped working," he said quietly. Really? There's bad news, I thought. Without Demeter's attentions, crops on Earth wouldn't grow, livestock wouldn't breed. That meant drought, famine, pestilence, and a high mortal death rate, not to mention a sharp decline in offerings to us. He nodded. She's been cursing the harvests, and I'll keep cursing them too, Demeter vowed, rising unsteadily and swiping at her bleary face with her gown, unless you bring her back. What would Zeus do next? My prophetic gift kicks in sporadically, never on command, so I had to guess. Knowing Zeus's weakness for mortals, especially pretty ones, I reasoned that he'd want to prevent any disasters leading to their extinction, which meant placating Demeter. Or did it? If Zeus rescued Cory, he'd be provoking Hades, who could be a vicious adversary. Tricky situation, I ventured. Zeus raised his big bushy eyebrows in agreement. Which is why you called me, I thought. As usual, I was right. 2. I've been stealing since I was born. Really. When I was 1 day old, I hopped out of my cradle and stole 50 cows from Apollo, in my swaddling clothes, I might add. I almost got away with it too, but Zeus made me confess. I didn't mind. I was only playing, and Apollo did forgive me right away. As for Zeus, the trick made him laugh long and hard, and he's had a soft spot for me ever since. Now I'm called Prince of Thieves, which I don't mind either. I like my work. Stealing isn't the only thing I do, of course. I escort the dead to the Underworld, carry messages for the immortals, guide travelers, invent musical instruments, and protect animals. In my spare time, I bring luck. I'm reasonably good at all these things, but when it comes to theft, I excel. No other god had the wherewithal to hustle down to hell and steal back Hades' bride with a minimum of fuss, and Zeus knew it. So, minutes after our conversation, I was in his chariot, happily taking up the reins. When Zeus told me I could drive it down to the Underworld, I nearly whooped for joy. His 6 colossal horses are as swift and powerful as thunderbolts. They fairly rip through the sky. I'm no slowpoke, but they can run circles around me. Zeus had never let me near them until today. I'll be careful, I promise, were my parting words. Now as I clucked them on, caution was the last thing on my mind. How fast can you really go? I whispered. They heard me. Their ears went flat and they leaped into the air like sparks out of a fire. Holy Charybdis, I thought, my stomach dropping. Mount Olympus fell away until its snowy peak was a white blur, and as we rose even higher, I clenched my eyes against the frigid blaze of starlight. I could swear I felt the crackle of ice in my lungs. Then the horses dropped without warning, and we were tumbling through the heavens like lava coursing down Mount Etna. It was supremely exciting. If we crash, who cares, I thought, giggling helplessly as we approached the earth. It was the best ride I'd ever had. Then as the hills of Arcadia rose up to meet us, the horses slowed, and their headlong plunge became a stately measured canter. It wasn't my doing. I was so giddy I was barely hanging onto the reins. By the time we got to the mouth of Taenarus Cave, they were trotting. In we went, as smoothly as you please. I come here all the time. I lead the dead down to Hades through the cave, but Zeus's horses had never made the trip, so I was afraid they'd be skittish in the tunnel. But they weren't. They jogged along with perfect composure, and before long, I'd regained my composure too. When I was finally breathing normally again, I began to compare the good and bad points of my situation. I had started doing this long ago, on the advice of my brother Apollo. He believes in taking stock, reasoning things out, and planning carefully. Of course, I'd already agreed to rescue Cory, but I'd fallen into the habit of making lists in my head anyway, and now I did it just for fun. Good. Incredible ride, unforeseen, possibly thrilling dangers, warm gratitude of lovely Cory and her mother, rolling tide of rich mortal offerings, paternal approval, always a plus. Bad. Hades isn't called the Lord of Darkness for nothing. He holds a mean grudge. Well, that's clear enough, I thought. The good far outweighs the bad. That had been Zeus's view also. If Hades tries to stop you, he'd advised as I was leaving, quote the regulations to him. Cory is free to leave if she hasn't eaten anything. It's a footnote in the admissions section. The regulations are endless and incredibly boring. I couldn't believe that Zeus had actually read them, but he can be surprisingly thorough sometimes. And he has an amazing memory. Any being admitted to Hades, he'd recited, must remain for 46 million lunar cycles, or in perpetuity, whichever is longer, if he, she, or it has consumed the food of the dead. If while in Hades, said being has not chewed, swallowed, inhaled, absorbed, or in any other manner ingested the aforementioned food of the dead, he, she, or it may leave upon verbal or written request. How could she eat anything in that place? Demeter had cried. It's a sinkhole. Nah, she probably hasn't, Zeus had replied, and I agreed. Cory is an immortal. Like the rest of us, she eats only for amusement. She wouldn't eat down there. She'd be too miserable. And in that case, my job would be much easier. Old stickler Hades had to abide by his own regulations, didn't he? 3. There's no sun in hell. Only a grayish half-light like winter fog. The air is still, static as only a place without weather can be, and faintly acrid. The horses coughed with their first breath of it. I couldn't blame them. Though I've been here countless times, that first whiff always puts me off, too. I slowed the horses to a walk as we neared the river. The Styx isn't much more than a deep channel, but its milky green waters are poisonous, so I decided to leave the horses behind just to be safe. I told them to halt, and they did. Hermes, is that you? Paddling toward us was old Charon, who ferries the dead across the river. His sight is bad, but his ears are as big as discuses, and very sharp. I will sometimes startle him by approaching his ferry very, very quietly, which he hates, but not today. There was no sneaking up on him with 6 horses. Charon is irascible and greedy. He demands, and gets, money from every one of his passengers, which to me is adding insult to injury. In my opinion, it's bad enough to be dead without having to pay for transportation, too. And what can Charon possibly do with the money? There's not much to buy down here. Yes, it is, I replied, stepping down from my chariot carefully. The riverbank was muddy, and I wanted to keep my sandals clean. I would need speed today, and infernal mud tends to slow them down. I thought so, he grunted. Across the river, Cerberus jumped and snarled, showing far too many teeth, even for a dog with 3 heads. I was glad, as I always am, that he was chained. Cerberus is hell's watchdog. He stops escapees by eating them. With all 3 mouths going, it's a hideous sight. I tied up the horses and checked my provisions. Ox liver treats for Cerberus, cap of invisibility for me, silver coin for Charon. Then I boarded the ferry. After crossing the Styx, I skirted the asphodel fields, the place where most mortals go when they die. As always, the flat green expanses were splashed with white, pink, and yellow asphodels in bloom, and the air was milder and less acrid than it was at the river. The fields are pleasant enough in a spare, featureless way. Nothing but flowers, a few shade trees, and the occasional cloth pavilion to break the monotony. Of course, the dead don't really need much more. They don't eat, they don't sleep, and they don't need shelter because the weather's always mild. So they're left to wander listlessly, trading gossip and complaining about the lack of entertainment. They're overjoyed to see me when I visit because I tell them jokes. And I have to admit they're my best audience. They like puns, they like riddles, they even like mortal jokes. What did the mortal say when Cerberus bit him? Ouch, 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 makes them howl. And what did Zeus say when the mortal built a house near Mount Olympus? There goes the neighborhood, gets them every time. I usually can't resist the temptation to make them laugh, but today I didn't stop. I was bound for the other part of hell, where the wicked live in torment and Hades lives in a bad mood. Tartarus. It was there that I would find Cory. 4. Tartarus is near the fields, but so different it could be in another realm altogether. It's dank and stony, a soul shredder of a place where the wicked suffer and the Furies come to watch. Whenever I visit, I feel as if I'm losing buoyancy. The wings on my sandals seem like weights, and moving swiftly takes effort. I passed through the great obsidian portals of Hades' palace, whose gleaming black surfaces turn every visitor's reflection into a wraith, and got ready to see Titius. I am never quite prepared. One step inside, and there he was, poor giant, splayed on a stone platform, writhing against his chains as 2 enormous blank-eyed vultures tore hungrily at his liver. It was his punishment, his eternal punishment, for offending Zeus. Did I mention that my father could be harsh at times? The 3 Furies watched from below, as gleeful as undetected felons at a public execution. This was how the bright-eyed, sharp-faced crones took a break from hounding and tormenting guilty souls. They watched evisceration. I've seen them place bets on which vulture would make Titius scream the loudest. The grisly spectacle was Hades' way of saying hello. I hurried along the stone passageway, trying as always to ignore Titius' cries, and soon came upon a man flailing in the air above a food-laden banquet table. This was Tantalus, whose mad hubris had led him to kill his young son, cook him up, and feed him to Zeus and Demeter. He wanted to test them to see if they knew what they were eating. Their horror quickly became implacable wrath. and they hung Tantalus here like a fly in a web to starve for all time. You were wrong about the gods, I thought, passing him by. They do know everything, they just don't always pay attention. The last unfortunate in this dreary exhibit was Sisyphus. To me, he was the saddest of all, though the others might disagree. If offered the choice, Titius or Tantalus might actually prefer his punishment to their own, for Sisyphus was not suffering daily liver extraction or acute aching starvation. He was merely pushing a huge boulder up a steep stone ramp, only to see it roll down again, over and over and over, until the end of time. I paused for a moment at the base of the ramp. Sisyphus had once been a king famed for his cleverness. He had founded the great city of Corinth, and then dared to capture Thanatos, the death spirit, so that no one on earth could die. This bold act had angered both Hades and Zeus to the frothing point, and in a rare moment of fraternal accord, they had cast him down here. Now he knew only sweat and frustration. It was a splendid trick, I thought, watching his slow ascent. Inspired. If it were up to me, I'd free you right now. The moral support was unspoken and probably didn't help him one bit, but I couldn't do more, unless I was willing to face a thunderbolt or two, which I was not. So I pushed away my futile thoughts and summoned up a burst of speed. It was time to face Hades. 5. There are many long, immensely tall stone corridors on the way to the throne room, but my winged sandals made short work of them, even at an old man chases young thief speed, which was the best I could do at the moment. When I arrived at the entry, the 4 blank-faced guards remained impassive, probably because they couldn't see me. An unseen arrival provides many opportunities for eavesdropping and borrowing, 2 of my favorite pastimes, so I was already wearing my cap of invisibility. I glided in past the guards. Hades was on his black diamond throne, deep in conversation with Cory, who sat beside him on a gleaming new diamond throne of her own. She looked as beautiful as ever, slim and barefoot and slightly unkempt, but now she wore garlands of gold and gems rather than flowers, and a morose pout. Except for the guards, she and Hades were alone. But why? Hades was asking, almost pleadingly, as I drew near and settled down. Because it's ugly, she replied, twining a long wheat-colored ringlet around her index finger. Because a garden should be beautiful and fragrant and uplifting. It should have a soul, not a, what did you call it, a projected something. Projected yield. Incredible, she murmured, shaking her head so that her curls rearranged themselves fetchingly on her bosom. She picked up another ringlet and teased it, unaware of the effect she was having on Hades, who watched her slacked mouth. He's practically drooling, I thought. I've never seen him like this. And then it came to me. Hades was in love. My sour, nitpicky, rules and regulations uncle in love? What a wonderful joke. I stopped my laughter just in time by squeezing my nose and bending double. My eyes teared up with the effort. Give Ascalaphus a different job, said Cory. But he's an excellent gardener, objected Hades. He works wonders down there, without any sunshine or rainfall, and he's not suited for much else, not the sharpest sword in the armory, poor man. She played with her hair in silence. His radishes are very tasty, his leeks, too, and those peaches of his are delicious. Just the sight of them drives Tantalus wild. You really should try one, he added, with a quick glance at her. She exhaled derisively. If you insist on keeping me here, she said, I'd like something to do, something I actually enjoy, like gardening. But, Hades began. It's not as if I don't know how, she interrupted. I've worked with my mother, Demeter, goddess of the cornfield, barley mistress, torch-bearing fury. She pronounced this with an angry emphasis. All my life. Before you kidnapped me, I was nurturing the crops of entire countries. If that means anything, she concluded bitterly. Hades was visibly stricken. I want you to be happy, he stammered. If you won't let me go, let me have the garden. She looked at him in the eye without a trace of fear. At that moment, she could have been her mother's twin. Hades sighed. The lines on his face seemed to deepen. Then he bowed his head slowly, giving assent. I'll speak to Ascalaphus, he said, rising. Best if you stay here. As you wish, replied Cory, watching him passively as he strode away. The instant he was gone, her face softened, her eyes filled with tears, and she let out a high whimper like a kitten's. Then, eyes clenched, she began to cry in earnest, wailing and sobbing much as Demeter had. It was a sorry sight. I leapt to my feet, pulling off my cap. "Cory!" I said. "Don't cry." Seeing me, she yelped in surprise. "Hermes, what are you doing here?" "I've come to take you home," I said. "If you'd like to go." I smiled. "Would you?" "Ha!" She laughed, choked, and coughed, and finally recovered herself. "What do you think?" Before I could reply, she wiped her face on her skirt and leaped up to embrace me. She was slender but muscular, smelling of hay and chamomile. "It is very good to see you," she said. Her bare feet had landed on my toes, and now she drew away. "Thanks," I replied, wishing I could put my cap on again. I was blushing furiously. Cory took no notice. "How is my mother?" she asked. "Very unhappy without you." She blinked, eyes brimming. "I miss her so," she said. "Does she know where I am?" I nodded. "She persuaded Zeus to send me here. I have his chariot," I told her, trying not to sound boastful. Still, I was pleased to see her eyes widen. Zeus's chariot was legendary. "I can fly you to Olympus as soon as you're ready," I said. "But first—" "I'm ready now," she cried, grasping my hand and hauling me toward the door so forcefully that I nearly tripped over my ankle wings. I enjoyed her strong grip almost as much as her embrace. Even so, I managed to halt her in the corridor. "You have to ask Hades' permission." That stopped her. "He won't let me go." "He must," I said, "by his own decree." And I quoted, "Any being admitted to Hades must remain for 46 million lunar cycles or in perpetuity, whichever is longer, if he, she, or it has consumed the food of the dead. If, while in Hades, said being is not chewed, swallowed, inhaled, absorbed, or in any other manner ingested the aforementioned food of the dead, he, she, or it may leave upon verbal or written request." "Ah," said Cory. Perhaps she doesn't understand, I thought. So I added, "As long as you haven't eaten anything, all you have to do is ask him to release you and he'll have to do it. By the way, I hear the food down here is terrible." The radishes look decent," she responded vaguely. I knew that tone of voice all too well. I used it often, when I couldn't tell the truth but didn't want to lie. Evasion is one of my standbys. Then she asked, "Could I try on your cap, maybe wear it till we get to the garden?" "Why not?" I handed it to her and she put it on, then twirled before me in her bare feet. "Am I invisible?" she asked eagerly. Her hopeful smile betrayed her. "Sorry, Cory, it only works for me." This wasn't strictly true. I could command it to work for anyone, but I wasn't about to tell her so. I had to abide by Hades' regulations. Zeus had been firm about that. Eyes downcast, she handed it back, and we walked on in silence. Nice try, I thought, wondering what she'd eaten and knowing I'd find out all too soon. 6. Hades' garden is just an ordinary little kitchen patch. A few rows of vegetables and herbs, some fruit trees, and a grape arbor, sitting at the back of the palace. It was certainly nothing to get exercised about, at least in my opinion, but as Cory and I walked in, we could see that Ascalaphus, a tall, stooped man wearing a filthy apron and a knotted head rag, was very troubled indeed. The shovel in his hands looked as if it were just barely propping him up, and he was staring at Hades like a stunned sacrificial bull. "Cory wants it," he said, "but it's mine. I've tended it for centuries. I want to keep tending it." "I've already told you, Ascalaphus," said Hades. "You deserve an easier job, something less demanding than the garden, and it doesn't have to be Sisyphus," he continued. "If you don't want to push this boulder down from the top of the ramp, you don't have to, though I thought you'd enjoy it." Ascalaphus shook his head morosely. "Maybe you could throw a grape at Tantalus every now and again," suggested Hades. "Add to his torment. What do you say?" Then, seeing us, he exclaimed, "Hermes, what brings you here?" "Greetings, uncle," I replied. "I've come at my father's behest." "You usually do," he replied sourly. "And what does he want?" "He wants you to let me go," Cory announced. "Hermes has come to take me home. I'm leaving, Hades." "Leaving?" echoed Hades, looking even more dumbfounded than his gardener. "But I've just finished telling Ascalaphus about the garden, that you wish to tend it." Ascalaphus was glaring at Cory as if she were a weed he'd like to pull, but she failed to notice. She was intent on prompting me. "Tell him," she said. "Remind him about the rule." "Rule? What rule?" asked Hades. It's in your code and regulations, I said, in section 46, subsection 2, and I quote, any being admitted to Hades must remain for 46 million lunar cycles, or in perpetuity, whichever is longer, and must thereafter abide by all existing codes and regulations, as well as those not yet formulated, particularly in regard to egress, which is strictly prohibited. Exactly, said Hades, with an I rest my case glance at Cory, who prodded me nervously. There's a footnote to the section, I said. It reads as follows. If, while in Hades, said being has not chewed, swallowed, inhaled, absorbed, or in any other manner ingested the food of the dead, he, she, or it may leave upon verbal or written request. Hades took this reminder of his own handiwork stolidly, and when Cory quickly made her formal request, he granted it with a nod. But when she turned and began to hurry away without a goodbye, he watched with such profound sadness that I felt sorry for him. Heartbroken, I thought, finding it not funny at all. She's going? Ascalaphus was confused. I can't keep her. It's in the regulations, said Hades. He was still trying to explain his wife's departure. By now she was skipping into the palace, when I took my leave. With effort I pushed into dog-running to long-lost master and caught up with her at Sisyphus's ramp. She was running hard, panting. You ate something, didn't you? I said. We passed Sisyphus, who was watching us from the corner of his eye, but kept on climbing. She slowed down. I couldn't help it, she admitted. I was bored, and the fruit looked so good. I ate 5 pomegranate seeds, that's all. But Hades didn't see me. Let's hope not, I thought. We neared Tantalus, who was straining to reach a gleaming pitcher inches below him and failing. Grunts of desperation gave way to screams of frustration. The Furies, perhaps bored with Titius, had settled near Tantalus like a trio of crows. They watched happily, gobbling fruit, cheese, and olives. Hermes, take me with you, Tantalus shouted. I'll reward you handsomely, I swear. Just cut me down. I have no sympathy for Tantalus. His crime was heinous, far worse than anything Sisyphus or Titius ever did, yet he cries for mercy, while they suffer in silence. On the other hand, the Furies mock him with special savagery. I've seen them offer him bits of meat, calling it child's flesh, and then when he reached for it anyway, drop it to the floor so he couldn't have it. Maybe next time, I called. Zeus's team watched us with their ears pricked as we crossed back over the sticks on the raft. There they are, I said proudly, the fastest horses in creation. You'd better hang on to me when we take off. I will, breathed Cory. I felt positively heroic. 7. The horses were eager to go. They danced in place, nodding their massive heads and swishing their tails. Cory stood behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist, her breath warm on my back as I took up the reins. It was a most pleasant sensation. Ready? I asked. Stop! The shout cut off her reply. It was Hades, who stood with Ascalaphus on Charon's ferry. Stop, he repeated, before I bring on the Furies. They were mid-river. Charon was rowing harder than a galley slave in a sea battle. Cory clutched me. Let's go, she whispered. We can still get away. I turned to stare at her. No one gets away from the Furies. If Hades sent them, they would follow us twice around the world, screeching lustily all the way, and Cory knew it. But if she knew, she didn't care, because she snatched the reins from me and cracked them hard before I could stop her. Hades jumped onto the shore. Cory! He cried. It was the sound of raw torment, as pained as anything I had ever heard from Titius or Tantalus or Sisyphus. Ascalaphus trailed him, bellowing. And then 2 things happened. Ascalaphus charged at us, and the horses leapt into the air. We were about 6 feet off the ground when Ascalaphus caught hold of a wheel, and then, like a bear clambering over a log, he hoisted himself into the chariot. I am coming with you, he grunted. Hermes, gasped Cory, clutching my chest. But there was nothing I could do. The startled horses were bucking and rearing in the air, and it took all my strength to subdue them. As I did, I wondered what had prompted Ascalaphus to join us. Surely he wasn't trying to escape. He was too attached to his garden. But if he was chasing Cory out of loyalty to Hades, he was making a serious mistake. If you succeed in bringing her back, I thought, you'll lose your precious garden. You're no match for Cory. I felt a twinge of sympathy for him. He wasn't a bad fellow, though he could have used better manners. As we flew over the asphodel fields, he ranted at Cory.
You lied! You betrayed your husband! You broke his heart! I've told him you ate those seeds! I saw you! I will tell Zeus! He will send you back! And then you will be Hades' wife forever!"
Cory trembled as his accusations hit her. "Shut up, you stinking dung beetle," she retorted, but it had no effect. He kept berating her through the tunnel in the dark all the way to the mouth of Taenaris' cave. Meanwhile, the inevitable lists were taking shape in my mind. Good. Cory reunited with Demeter, grateful to me for rescue. Zeus's horses unharmed, possibly available again. Bad. Ascalaphus swearing that Cory broke the rules. Zeus honor-bound to return her to Hades. Demeter miserably unhappy. No paternal approval, no horses, no Cory. There was no getting around it. The bad far outweighed the good. Zeus would be disappointed, and I'd never drive his team again, much less enjoy Cory's favor. Unless I came up with a solution. 8. Demeter and Cory embraced with the kind of ferocity that wins wrestling matches, sobbing as they rocked back and forth in each other's arms. It was a touching sight, and it went on for a long time. Long enough for Ascalaphus to begin a slow advance toward Zeus's throne. With his dirt-encrusted hands and leathery feet, his ragged kerchief and sweat-stained apron, the gardener looked distinctly out of place up here, and my father threw me a questioning look. I raised an eyebrow, indicating that I would keep silent until Ascalaphus had spoken. Which, once Cory and Demeter had retreated to a corner with their arms around each other, he proceeded to do.
"Almighty Zeus, Father of Heaven, leader of the Fates, hear me," he began. "I am Ascalaphus, Hades' gardener, and I have a complaint."
"Yes?"
"That woman,"
he pointed in Cory's direction with a gnarled finger,
"has ill-treated my master. She lied to him, then she left him."
Zeus's expression was not exactly one of moral outrage. He was often guilty of the very same behavior. "She lied?" he asked mildly. "How?" Cory burrowed deeper into her mother's bosom, and Demeter clutched her daughter even more tightly.
"She said she had not eaten while she was with us, but she did. She ate 5 pomegranate seeds out of my garden."
"You saw her?"
The gardener nodded. "He lies," wailed Cory. "No," cried Demeter.
"Be sure you're telling the truth," Zeus said to the gardener, with more than a hint of menace.
"I am, I swear it."
Knowing the dire import of Ascalaphus's vow, Zeus began to lose his equanimity. I knew the signs. A slight narrowing of the great dark eyes, a sudden flare of the nostrils, a tensing of the broad hands. If his fingers twitched, thunderbolt reflex, we were all in for trouble. Our eyes met. He summoned me by lifting his chin, and I hurried to his side, standing so that Ascalaphus could not see my face. Demeter and Cory, now coiled in a loose embrace, watched us intently. Fortunately, they were out of earshot. Nevertheless, Zeus kept his voice down. "Did Hades send him?" "He jumped into the chariot." "You should have pushed him off." What would that have solved, I wondered, but I knew better than to ask. "Did she eat the seeds?" There was no point in lying. "I'm sure of it," I said. "She really had no right to leave." He scowled. "I can't send her back. Demeter would never forgive me." "You don't want that," I said, and he rolled his eyes in agreement. "I wonder if they'd compromise," I added, as if I'd just thought of it. "Hades and Demeter?" He looked skeptical, and with good reason. Gods don't compromise. They consider it demeaning. Gods say what they want and get it, and if they don't, they do terrible, vengeful things. But this was an unusual situation, and it required an unusual resolution. "What do you have in mind, son?" he asked. I loved it when he called me that, as if I were unique, not one of thousands. Say that Cory has to stay with Hades half the year because she ate the pomegranate seeds, but that she can spend the rest of the year with Demeter. His face brightened. Clever! I maintained an air of modesty, though I agreed with him. It was a clever solution, and I knew it. "Thank you," I said, imagining myself vaulting into the blue behind his magnificent horses with Cory at my side. He patted my shoulder. "Let's hope it works." Well, it did work, in a mixed blessing kind of way. Since that time, mortals have had to put up with winter while Cory is with Hades, but they forget their woes as soon as she rejoins Demeter. The instant the two of them get together, the air warms, the earth turns fragrant, and green shoots start poking up out of the ground. The change makes mortals positively ecstatic. Since it began, they become more generous and more punctual with their offerings. Hades is happier now, too. I heard a rumor that he almost smiled once. As for Father, he's been very generous with his horses. "Go, enjoy," he says when I ask to borrow them. I've taken them out dozens of times. But Cory, who's taken to calling herself Persephone now that she's married, won't come along. "I can't," she always says. "I'm just too busy. I don't know how Hades ever ran this place by himself." Then with a shake of her head, she rejoins her dryad assistants. She's got a dozen of them. I was beginning to fear that marriage and ruling the underworld with her husband had changed more than Cory's name, but I didn't want to believe it, so I kept trying to entice her away. I made another attempt in late winter, on one of those sweet sunny days that cry out for celebration. I found Cory sitting near the garden, which now included beds of tall, solemn black flowers, surrounded by her dryads. Every time she spoke, they nodded. When I landed the chariot, they stared, then turned back to their conversation. "Care for a ride?" I called, trying to sound offhand. Cory looked at me. Her hair was bound up in a manner of a young matron, and her gown was rich and severe, a garment of deadly respectability. "I really can't," she said. I cringed. Her voice rang with the insincere regret of an adult denying a child. I never asked again.